Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen, wassalatu wassalamu ala ashrafil anbiya'i wal mursaleen, nabiyyina Muhammadi wa ala alihi wa sahbihi ajma'een. Amma ba'du, assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. I know we've been practicing, alhamdulillah, all week, mashallah. That wasn't too bad. Last few days I haven't been sleeping very well because the symphony of snoring has been keeping me awake. Symphony, so it was a concerted effort, bil jama'. It wasn't one individual that we want to point out. So this morning, alhamdulillah, I had the earbuds in, but those earbuds worked so well that I couldn't hear anything even when I took them out for a while. So now I'm a little bit better, alhamdulillah. So I'm just going to take this opportunity just to discuss a particular phenomenon. And this phenomenon, in a way, without us realizing it, it's there. We've observed it, we've mentioned it. I've had discussions with a few chaps about it as well, and I'm sure it's not going to come as a surprise when inshallah we do discuss it. But in order to discuss it first, we need to give a little bit of a background. Schoolboy error. Happens. We're all human. So just to give a little bit of a background. One of the things that we are introduced to and discussed to us, and in a way is sold to us, is the concept of democracy. It seems like a good practice, the ability to be able to stand up for what you believe in. How else can you decide when groups of people have different opinions? Surely the best way to do that is count everybody up. If the majority are in a certain place, then let's decide on that. And if the minority on this side, then we can't go on that. It seems like a sensible, logical, balanced way to address differences. And as long as we all accept the concept and we all buy into the concept, then sometimes it will be in our favor and sometimes it won't be in our favor. But at least it's a civilized way, a mature way, a modern way, a professional way of resolving disagreements and differences so that we can continue to live peacefully together. Couple that with the freedom of speech, to be able to say what you feel, to not feel that by saying something you're going to have unwanted pressure on you. You're going to be picked out, you're going to be isolated, potentially locked up. So the chance to be able to say what you feel, air your views, call out something when you think something is wrong, and even to a certain extent ridicule a particular way of life or a particular people. Add that now to this concept of self-identification, where now you're not restricted to how society perceives you. Rather, you decide how you want society to perceive you. You determine that. So we're seeing, for example, if a person doesn't feel like they should be referred to as a he, can now request that he is referred to as a they or a she. So this self-identification is a new, additional point to what we've already seen, say, with the democracy and freedom of speech. In essence, all three concepts push the view of liberty, push the view of absolute freedom of the self, absolute freedom of expression for the self. In a way, it centralizes the self. And in a way, it gives this unfettered freedom for the self to describe as it says, as it wants to be described. However, in reality, when we explore this a little bit further, is there a real absolute democracy? So for instance, now, we have two parties, and of those two parties, we struggle sometimes to determine how are they different by policy. There was a time, obviously, when I was growing up in the 70s and 80s, when there was a distinct difference between one party and the other party. One party was for a certain group of people. The other party was for another group of people. So depending on where you were in the social ladder, you would associate yourself to that particular party because it represented you. Now we look and it's a little bit confusing. Similarly, it's not really true democracy anymore. Or has it ever been? What I mean by that is, there has been numerous times when the people have stood up for something, whether it's through a YouGov poll, or whether it's through marches, or whether it's through something else, and yet the governments of that time have not budged. So the people have spoken, but it seems to have fallen on deaf ears. It doesn't seem to have got the impact that people believed it would have. And we see now the influence, particularly of corporate organizations, financing and budgeting particular parties, and as a consequence, buying influence as a result. So in reality, how unfettered is this democracy? Moving on, freedom of speech. Is it really absolute freedom of speech? Can you literally say what you want to say and not feel any comeback? Well, not really. We know that if you speak in a certain way, you could quite easily get labeled as being anti-Semitic. If you say something else, you could easily get labeled for being a trouble causer. If you associate yourself to a particular group of people because you believe in their views, you could easily be considered as associating yourself to a prescribed terrorist group. So in reality, is there absolute freedom of speech? So, you know, that is also fettered. It's managed. And finally, self-identification. If a person said, I identify as a police officer, then the police will say, this is impersonating a police officer, we're going to arrest you for that. If a person says, I identify as a member of the royal family, somehow I can't see that going down well, and I can't see them preparing a room for you in Buckingham Palace. And also, if you say that, oh, I identify as a chair, I think there's going to be phone calls made, and potentially you could be in a room all on your own for a while. Well, at least you won't need a chair to sit on. So the point is, when we look at all these three areas, which gives true liberty to the human, for the human to be, the self to be, the ego to be, as it wants to be, free from rules, free from judgment, free from that. But in reality, that is not the case. There are political and legal frameworks which prevent that happening. There are political and legal frameworks that prevent that happening. But you might say, it's an interesting topic. What's the relevance? Well, hopefully we'll get to the relevance. As we live in this type of surroundings, and as we buy into this sort of mantra, really, this dawah, that democracy is absolute, you really get a choice, you really decide. Freedom of speech is absolute, you can say what you want to say. Self-identification is absolute, you can be what you want to be. In reality, which I hopefully in the 5-10 minutes that I've discussed to you, or discussed with you rather, or presented to you, we are beginning to understand that that's not a real, that's an illusion. That's an illusion. It's an illusion. Because we've sort of bought into it, and we think, yeah, this is modern, this is the right thing. Strangely enough, the roots of democracy go back to the Greeks, reportedly approximately 600 years before even the arrival of Isa alayhi salam. So it's not like a new modern thing. It's older than Islam. It's older than Christianity. So it's a backward way of living, if we want to describe it in that way. What we find is when we have this kind of mindset, it drifts into our deen as well. Democracy, freedom of speech, self-identification. It comes into our deen. What do I mean by that? Democratization of fiqh, populist fiqh, meaning no longer is fiqh determined by what is right or what is wrong, or by the person speaking. It now depends how many followers you have. It doesn't matter now what's right or wrong anymore. It's about democracy. I agree with that, Sheikh. I agree with that. My opinion counts. This is why I call the democratization of fiqh. Populist fiqh. It's like the tail wagging the dog. The scholar now wants a fan base. So he's only going to say what makes you happy. He's not going to say what makes you upset because the masjid will empty and then Masjid Umar won't invite me down again. So painful truths now will be concealed. Instead, sweet nothings will be shared. Just to make sure that this democratization of fiqh, that this people making their choices, literally marching out on their own feet, is what has now determined what is truth and what is falsehood. Freedom of speech. That's now also come into our faith. Meaning, before people would be a little bit hesitant, that should I make a comment on this verse of the Quran? Should I make a comment about this particular hadith? Now, hey man, let's have a tea, let's have a chit chat, let's discuss this thing. So anyone now feels free to express an opinion on the deen. Remember its sources, where it came from. And finally, self-identification. If a person wants to identify as a sheikh, who are you to tell him he's not one? If a person wants to identify as a mufti, who are you to tell him he's not one? If a man can now identify as a woman, then surely a Muslim can identify as a mufti. So now we're seeing this self-identification. We don't need some external body or some external structure or some external framework to determine whether somebody's a scholar or not. You can just claim you are a scholar. That's good enough. So these three, democratization of the fiqh, populist fiqh, freedom of speech, self-identification, have made their way into our deen. Whether intentionally or unintentionally, Allahu A'lam. That's not for us to try to resolve. The fact is that we should become aware of it. That is happening. It has happened. Does Islam offer a method, a framework, like we saw the political framework? That even though we are in a democracy, it's moving towards an oligarchy. If we look across in the States, for example, which is the leader of the free world, unless you're a multi-millionaire or nearly a billionaire, you can't become a president of the United States of America. So it's now elitist. You've got to be powerful to become that person. Similarly, now we see, even within our own country, that you have to be very wealthy in order to reach that particular position now. So we see the political framework. We've also discussed the legal framework with regards to freedom of speech, that there are legalities that you cannot say anything and everything you want. It is some things are against the law. Some things are okay, but some things aren't. And similarly, when I discuss self-identification, again, there are certain things which are against the law. So does Islam have a framework? There is. I'm going to share with you two principles. These principles are, as we refer to them, as the aqwal of the Salafus Salihin, the statements of the pious predecessors. Firstly is, al-isnadu min ad-din. وَلَوْلَا الْإِسْنَادُ لَقَالَ مَنْ شَاءَ مَا شَاءَ. Now, isnad, chain of authority, my ustad, my ustad's ustad, my ustad's, his ustad's ustad, all the way up to Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, having that chain, like our Hazrat say, will have that chain. Any scholar that is sat in this room will have that chain. Al-isnad min ad-din. You have to have learnt your faith from another human. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala could have in all circumstances revealed a book to the people, to the masses. He always revealed a book to a man. The people followed the man. So that has always been our tradition. The companions followed the Prophet ﷺ. The tabi'een followed the companions. The tabi'een followed the tabi'een. And it went on and on and on, all the way up until right to this day, alhamdulillah, there are people here who will know their chain all the way up to the Prophet ﷺ. Al-isnad min ad-din. وَلَوْلَا الْإِسْنَادِ. If the concept of isnad did not exist, لَقَالَ مَنْ شَاءَ. Then anybody would be able to say about this deen of ours. مَا شَاءَ. Whatever he wants. So it actually cuts that out from the root. There is no freedom of speech when it comes to Islam, in this concept of Islam, as in the faith. Not as a political, not as a social construct, with regards to the scripture, with regards to the faith, with regards to the religion. We're not talking about social. We're not speaking about political. Speaking about the faith. Because if this isnad did not exist, anybody would come up and express an opinion, which is what we see now. Oh, I heard there's a minority opinion by Imam Ghazali that this is permissible. Subhanallah. What has that got to do with you who is a follower of a particular legal school? What has that got to do who is a follower of this? What's that got to do with that? You can find minor opinions about anything. In fact, I do not even feel comfortable to share some of the minor opinions that have been written by ulama. That does not mean that we just pick any minor opinion and make a deen from it. The other principle, إن هذا العلم دين فانظروا عمن تأخذون دينكم. This knowledge is your deen. This knowledge is your deen. So be careful from whom you take your deen from. Meaning, look at that person. What qualities does this person have? What knowledge does this person have? Then take your ilm from that person. Don't just willy-nilly, oh, I just did a search on Google, it came up. Okay, what was the website? I don't know, I'm not sure where the website is. Well, who's approved it? I'm not sure. So you can't just do a search, pull something off, and now start practicing it. Oh, I came across this Islamic book and it said it's a hadith. Well, is it hadith? You know, we were having a conversation with a particular brother about one particular which was ascribed to the Prophet ﷺ, and it does not exist, but you will find it on people's Facebooks or social media, and they're quoting it as though it's a hadith. So if you now take it from there thinking it's a hadith because it says the Prophet ﷺ said, and you now using it, how do you know it's a hadith? Where have you taken your ilm from? So how do we remedy that? And this is the framework that Islam has given to remedy this. Otherwise, matters will be decided by popularity. Matters will be decided by popularity. Matters will not be decided by how close this is to the Quran or how close this is to the Hadith. It will be decided by how popular is this opinion. People will feel free to speak about the deen as and when and how they choose. Why? Because of this concept of feeling that this freedom of speech is absolute. When I've described that even in the political spheres and in the social spheres, it is not absolute. I've just demonstrated that. It's managed, it's controlled. Because a society cannot work if it's absolute unfettered and you can say what you want, you can be what you want, and you can go. We see this as well. As I said, it's now coming into the matters of deen, especially like, for example, when we talk about self-identification. I mentioned there when somebody wants to be a scholar. Somebody wants to identify as a Muslim. He eats pork, he drinks alcohol, he says they're halal. He says, I'm a Muslim. So even though the category of definition of a Muslim is there in black and white, he does things which is completely opposite to that. And yet he says, but I identify as a Muslim. So when has it ever been within the Sharia, within the Islamic concept, that is how a person identifies himself? So a person can come forward and say that, oh, I believe that Jesus is the Son of God. I believe this, I believe that, but I identify as a Muslim. So like we have framework as to how much and how far self-identification can go, in the same way, our Sharia also has this framework to prevent anything like that. Because it might be that we can make those choices as we wish, but we also have another responsibility. And that other responsibility, especially the ulama, their responsibility is to make sure that they preserve this deen for the next generation. That's their job. They are a chain, they are a link rather in that chain. Now if the world is not going to end for another 1,000 years, their job is to make sure that they maintain it, and then when the next generation comes, they pass it on to them in that same preserved format. There was a little statistic I read that even if you made, I can't remember the figures now, I should have read it before I came on, even if you made a 1% change on a daily basis, when you compound a 1% change, it comes up with a big number. I don't know what the number is. My point I'm making is, if you're walking along a straight line and you only deviate by 1 degree, so if you and I both set off together and you just deviate by 1 degree, obviously 360 degrees, you deviate by 1 degree, and I carry on going. Eventually, far down that track, you're going to be miles away from me. You're going to be miles away from me, but all we deviated was by 1 degree. So the job of the ulama and the responsibility that they've been given is to ensure that that 1 degree change does not come. That 1 degree change does not come. So the preservation of Islam, both for us as a community that's practicing it now, and also for the communities that comes after, has been decreed to us, has been explained to us to make sure that we keep to these 2 principles. Principle 1 is to ensure that we're engaging with somebody who has sanad, who can link himself all the way to the Prophet ﷺ. That's the first thing. Why? Because this person now will speak in an appropriate way. And there will be times, even though somebody who has sanad may say inappropriate things. We have checks and balances within our deen to ensure that there's a hierarchy of ulama, that those obscure opinions, those outlier opinions are fixed within the system. And eventually they will not be passed on to the generation which comes after. It will be removed. The next thing to bear in mind is anything you're learning about deen, any ilm that you're learning about the deen, it's important that that ilm is coming from a reliable source. It is coming from a reliable source. And because we've been sort of inculcated to have this self-realization, the importance of the self, the importance of the ego, the importance of recognizing what you want to be and how you want to be, this unfettered thing. This is also a danger because for us as Muslims, we're always told to abide by and stay within frameworks. We cannot have this complete freedom, this liberty as is described. Because when you're taking liberty, who are you taking your liberty from? Who are you dissociating from? Who are you freeing yourself from? And we are described as soon as we become baligh as mukallaf. Not somebody who's free. Somebody who is mukallaf. Somebody who just now had a big rock placed on his back. Mukallaf comes from the word taklif. Taklif, as we know, even in Urdu, means something which is harm, burdensome, difficult, mushkil, hard, waghaira. So as soon as we become bulugh, as soon as our ma'soom time ends, as soon as the fun and games are over, we now are burdened. We are not free. We are far from free. We were free, but nobody told us when we were kids. That was a time when we were free. There was no accountability. We were overlooked. Our mistakes were overlooked. Our statements were overlooked. Raf'ul qalam, yani at this point, is ma'soom. If he says something, is ma'soom. If he doesn't pray salah, is ma'soom. If he says something, is ma'soom. But as soon as bulugh reaches, that burden falls on those shoulders. The freedom disappears. So therefore, as much as they exist within our social circles, as much as they exist within our political circles, what we have to do is make sure that they don't filter into our deen. Because our deen has its own setup, has its own system, has its own framework, and that's the framework that we have to adhere to. Before I finish off, I want to take this opportunity for all those satis, alhamdulillah, that have been looking after myself and also all the mu'takifun whilst we've been here. Very friendly brothers, mashallah, may Allah bless you all. We've been overfed. I don't know whether that's because we're going to be slaughtered for udhi or something. But we've been looked after, we've been cared for. So may Allah bless you all. May Allah SWT accept all that we've done. Ameen. Wa akhiru da'wana alhamdulillah rabbil alameen. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.